Morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tosim Mishpach of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Sherman Drashos this year as a schus for Besaros Tavos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av, Haba Alina Litova, Stephen, Wendy Drazen, in honor of their parents, Israel Drazen, Dina Drazen, Eileen Rosenzweig, and in memory of Stanley Rosenzweig, Zichron Lebracha. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Saeed and Sima Hakim, for the refuah shlema for their niece, Nechama Bas Chaya Fega, who is undergoing lengthy and complicated surgery today. She should have a refuah shlema together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Hashem, allow our hostages to come home b'shalom and b'karv, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful b'chol maaseh yedeim. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem. Today's daf is Memches 48, but we are picking up on Mem Zayin Amud Beis at the second Mishnah, or the first Mishnah on the page, probably about 12 lines down. Shlosha batim heim. There are three different types of homes. Now, obviously, it's Maseches Avoda Zara. So as one could guess, our topic is Avoda Zara. Excellent, right? Although it's not always that way in Shas, but it happens to be in this Masechta. We're pretty consistent, all Avoda Zara all the time. So therefore, the Mishnah says as follows: there are three different types of homes when it comes to Avoda Zara. What does that mean? Gemara says as follows: if a home was built from the beginning for Avoda Zara, in other words, you have a home that literally again was built for Avoda Zara purposes, halacha l'maisa, again that home is aser. Aser ba'no, good. Now again, remember, as you've seen already, if it was built by an akum, then what? You can be mevatel it. You can do that. Built by a Jew, can't be mevatel it. Okay. Saido v'kaido la'avodas kochavim. Let's say you have a regular home. The home was built for regular mundane purposes, but then an akum came along and he plastered it or he decorated it for avodas kochavim, v'chidesh, and he added something to the home. L'kavod avodas kochavim, no tamasha mechadesh. Ultimately, if he removes any of the what we'll call Avoda Zara additions, then the home becomes permitted. Category 3, if it was just a regular house, but it's time that the Akum brought his idol into the house. So when the idol is in the house, ultimately the house is usher. Why? Because the house is considered to be serving Avoda Zara, right? It's attending to Avoda Zara. But once the Avoda Zara is removed, ultimately again the house becomes permitted. So therefore, three categories. Category 1, you build a house for the sake of Avoda Zara, the house is usher. Category 2, you build a house for regular mundane purposes, but then you add on something for Avoda Zara. You plaster it, you paint it, you decorate it. Remove the plaster, remove the decorations, remove the additions. House is mutter. Case number 3, regular house. You just, Akum brought his Avoda Zara into it. When the Avoda Zara is there, house is unfit for use. Asr ba'na. Once the Avoda Zara ultimately is removed, house is mutter. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav, Hamishtacha l'bayis asr. Rav says if one bows down to a house, ultimately it's asr. Now, this is very interesting. Right, so again, in this case over here, it sounds like you have a regular house, and then an akum came along and bowed down to his house. What's the halacha? Aser. Alma kasavar talosh olabasof chibru kitalosh dami. So what do you see from here? See from it saying that was detached and then attached retains its detached status. Because think about this: a home is made of materials. The materials were originally detached. Now you attach them to the ground, right? And you worship them. So remember, up until now, we've always been focusing on the idea that anything that is mechuber, anything that is attached to the ground, can't become aser. So you see from the fact that Rav says that you could bow down to a house and make it aser indicates to us that as long as it was initially detached, even if you now attached it, halacha l'maisa, it is mutter. I'm sorry. It is usher. It is like it's detached and therefore can be made into Avoda Zara. I think more so 1 second. Va'anan, binotnan. But ultimately, again, but we learned halacha l'maisa. The only way that it's usher is if you originally go ahead and build it for the sake of Avoda Zara, which sounds like, again, the only way a home becomes usher is only if from the beginning, from its inception, that it was worshipped. So the Gemara says, "Beno afapish lo ishtachavelo hishtachave afapish lo beno." No, the way it works is both actually. Whether you went ahead and built it for the sake of Avoda Zara, even if you never actually worshipped it, or you bowed to it, even though you didn't build it for the sake of Avoda Zara, either way, halacha l'maisa, that house becomes Avoda Zara. If that's the case, if that's the case, then there aren't three categories of houses. There are four categories of houses, right? Because category one was you built a home for the sake of Avoda Zara. Category two, you decorated for Avoda Zara. Category three, you housed Avoda Zara inside of it. Now there's a fourth category. What's the fourth category? The fourth category is it was built for mundane purposes, and then you bowed down to it. Why isn't that category included? Because you're supposed to remember again, why are we learning this? Right? So first of all, what's the point of a Mishnah like this? So the Gemara highlights the point of the Mishnah like this is also to indicate to us what is Avodah Zara, and therefore we could know how to be mevatla Avodah Zara. Since when it comes to bittul, now remember, you're going to say, how are you mevatla Avodah Zara? So remember, if the akum has the ability to decommission it, essentially by damaging it, even in some small way, right? If he damages it, ultimately, again, it is mutter. So whether you built it for the sake of Avodah Zara, or ultimately it was built for mundane purposes, but worshipped afterwards, either way, from the decommissioning perspective, the process is the same. Since the decommissioning process is the same, those two, bana, building it, and ishtachava, bowing down to it, are lumped together in one category. Okay, incredible. Mishnah, Shalosh Avanim, there are three different types of stone, right? For Avodah Zara purposes. Category one, Even shechatzva metchila lebimus, harei asura. If stone was originally quarried, ultimately, again, to be the pedestal for Avodah Zara. Bimus means like the platform upon which the Avodah Zara is situated. So that's why the stone was quarried from the beginning. Harei asura. That stone is aser. Saida, v'kaida shem kochavim. What happens if you had a stone? Stone was quarried for regular, whatever, mundane purposes, or no purpose at all. And then you plastered it or you painted it for the sake of Avodah Zara. No tamasha sied v'kied umuteres. If you remove the paint or the plaster from the stone then becomes permitted for use. What happens again if the stone wasn't quarried for Avodah Zara, right? Stone was quarried for mundane purposes, and you didn't do any additions to the stone, but you just put Avodah Zara on top of the stone. Then what Rabbi say? When the Avodah Zara is situated on top of it, the stone is also. But if the Avodah Zara is removed from it, then ultimately the stone is mutter. Stone cases very much parallel the house cases. Next, says the Gemara. Rabbi Ami, so the Gemara says, when we talk about this idea of plastering or painting over the stone, it has to be, the Gemara is suggesting over here, Rabbi Ami is suggesting, it has to be that you did something actually to the physical stone itself, not just that you applied some type of plaster or paint on top of the stone, but it has to be that you actually did something with the guf, with the body of the stone itself. Says the Gemara, but the Gemara says, but we're comparing the case of the stone to the case of the house. Ubayis lav begufehu emisar. And when it comes to a home, when you talk about plastering or painting, nothing's going into the house itself, right? It's being applied on the exterior of the house, and yet that's problematic. Gemara says, no, bayis nami iki bini arvi. Gemara says, no. Even a house, when you have like stones or bricks, there's the area in between the stones or bricks into which the plaster or the paint or the decoration is able to get in. The Gemara says, in a house case, are we not dealing with a case where the house is already previously plastered or painted? And now what are you doing? You're adding on an additional layer for the sake of Avodah Zara. So nothing is happening to the actual body of the house itself. Anything that's done is exterior work. Ella, ki itmar Rabbi Ami le'inyan bittul itmar. No, rather, when Rabbi Ami made his statement, ultimately, again, he was making it in terms of bittul, meaning what? V'afagav d'sayid v'kayid v'gufa shel even ki notal mashechidish shapir dami. So both said this is very interesting. What Rabbi Ami is coming to add is as follows: I have a stone, right? The stone was quarried for no particular reason. Then what happens? I paint it or I plaster it for the sake of Avodah Zara. They both say, what's ta'alacha in that situation? What's ta'alacha? What did the Mishnah say? If you remove the paint or the plaster, or the decoration, the stone is good to go. And bless you, you do not have to do, Rabbi Ami is adding, you do not have to do anything with the actual body. You don't have to physically change the body of the stone itself in order to be mevatel the Avodah Zara identity. Why is that? The Gemara says, "Ma'od de'tema, kevan shesiyed v'kiyed begufo shel even, ke'even shechatza mitchil avodas kochavim damya v'tissar kula." Because you might have thought that once you paint or you plaster or you decorate the stone in its entirety, maybe that makes it like a stone that was originally quarried for Avoda Zara purposes. In which case, the stone itself is fundamentally asur, and maybe to be mavatalit, you have to mamish do something with the body of the stone itself. Kamash malon, no. That when you paint, plaster, decorate it, all you need to do is what? Remove that exterior paint, plaster, or decoration, and you need not do anything with the body of this body of the stone itself, in order to go to be mevatel the avodah zara. So we'll say very interesting, very interesting. We'll say there's a tremendous Moshe Haskell in this as well, which is what's happening over here. The stone is becoming tainted with avodah zara. So now, what's the Gemara asking? Same thing with the house. House, stone. Right? You painted it, right? This house started regular. The stone started regular, meaning not avodah zara. Then what happens? You painted it. You plastered it for the sake of avodah zara. So I'm at a thought that now that I have changed the house, in order to restore it back to its previous holy setting, I have to make some type of comprehensive cathartic change to the body of the house or the stone itself. Kamash malon, that sometimes the pathway to meaningful change could be exterior change, could be cosmetic change, could be little things that fundamentally alter identity. All I need to do is strip away the plaster, strip away the paint. I don't have to do anything to the body of the stone or body of the house. In the world of change, sometimes the object, the entity, or the person is so broken that the change has to be comprehensive and cathartic. The house itself has to be changed. The stone itself has to be changed. And other times, seemingly relatively easy, minor exterior changes can be made, and that makes all the difference. And I both say sometimes when we know that we want to change, we get so scared of the comprehensive, cathartic, like house change or stone change. Meanwhile, all we need in life is sometimes some tweaks. A little bit, remove a little plaster over here, remove a little paint over here. Even sometimes the smallest exterior changes in the way we live, in the way we conduct ourselves, could have the most tremendous effect. Incredible. Top of Memches, 48a Mishnah. Shalosh Asherah saying, there are three different types of Asherah trees. Ilon shenatu mitchila shem avodos kachavim, harei asura. Now here's what's interesting. We're going to see something fascinating, which is we've always thought, and maybe I'm just projecting, right? We've always thought that an Asherah tree is a particular type of tree. Like there's a species called Asherah. It turns out that is not the case. By the way, there's also no tooth fairy. So it's fascinating. So the Gemara says, an Asherah, now again, we'll see actually it's subject, there's discussion about this, right? But Lamaisa, an Asherah is not as much a type of tree as much as a tree that's worshipped for Avodah Zara is called an Asherah tree. So Shalosh Asherah saying, I think there was Asherah. Even Shanatam Asura. Anytime that you plant a tree for the sake of Avodah Zara, it doesn't matter. It's a redwood, it's a fir. All right, that's not all I know, right. So yeah, that's it. So the Maisa again. So the Maisa, I planted for the sake of Avodah Zara. That's called an Asherah. That's called an Asherah. So the Gemara says, fine. Asura Gido upis l'shem avodas kachavim. The Gemara says that's category one. Category two is you have a regular tree, right? The tree was planted for regular mundane tree purposes. Then what happens? Gido epislo. I prune it, and I cut it. Ultimately, again, pislo literally means I trim it. I prune it or I trim it for the sake of avodah zarah. So we'll say, so in this case over here again, tree was planted for regular mundane purposes. Then what happens? I prune it and I trim it for the sake of avodah zarah. V'hichlif, and now again it regrows. Notel mashehichlif. So ultimately, again, then I will say in this case, that which regrows is aser al avodah zarah, right? Because in this case, the tree is planted for mundane purposes. I prune it and I trim it for the sake of avodah zara. The new growths, therefore, are avodah zara. So how do you go ahead and restore this tree back to its permitted status? Take away or cut off the new growths. If you went ahead and you had a regular tree, but you placed an Avoda Zara, right? You placed an Avoda Zara underneath the tree, the notla, and then it was removed. Harez muteres. So apparently, while the Avoda Zara is under the tree is usher because it's considered to be serving Avodah Zarah. But once you go ahead and remove the Avodah Zarah from underneath the tree, then ultimately, again, the tree becomes permitted once again. Incredible. So those are our three categories. So again, you can begin to see that the three categories of trees, the three categories of stones, the three categories of homes, all closely resemble one another. Category number two was where I planted a tree that was planted for regular mundane, right, regular purposes, and then halacha l'maisa, I pruned it or I trimmed it for the sake of avodah zarah. In that case, the new growths are the ones that are aser. So and this is assuming, of course, that you pruned or you trimmed the actual body of the tree. The Gemara says. Gido So we'll say, see, here's what's interesting. So Rabbi Yanai says that we're talking about over here, Hivrich. Hivrich means you grafted, right? Hirkiv means, right? So we'll say, so what does this mean? Rabbi Yanai is coming along and saying, what's the case? The case is where you're doing something much more substantial with the tree, right? Ultimately, again, you're going ahead and you're grafting it, or these two processes. So hivrich means to graft it. Hirkiv means, Rashi points out over here, that you take one part of the tree, you put the top into the ground, it grows roots over here, then you cut it, and it becomes two independent trees. Marsa 1 second. But that's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says even if you graft it or trim it, that makes it avodah zarah. Elaki itmar Rabbi Yana ve'inyan bittul itmar. No, Rabbi Yana's statement is rather relevant when it comes to bittul, negating avodah zarah, decommissioning. How so? This is very interesting. The itmar. Afagav the hevrich veherkev v'gufo shal ilon kinat al ma shehichlef shaper dami. The Rebbe said this is very interesting. Even if you grafted, or we'll call both of these grafting, right? There's two ways to graft. You could go ahead and graft one tree into another, or like I said, if you could imagine, let's say you have like a sapling, right? So it's bendable. You take the top part of the sapling, you bend it down to the ground, you plant that top. That top then develops roots. Once it develops roots, you then cut it like in the middle of, we'll call it the bow. And now effectively you have two trees. So the Gemara says, what would you have thought? You might have thought that these grafting cases, maybe it's as if you've actually planted the tree from the beginning for the sake of avodah zarah. But obviously, as we've seen, once you're creating something for the sake of avodah zarah from the beginning, that takes on a much greater severity. I might have thought that grafting is the equivalent to planting something from the beginning for avodah zarah purposes. Kamash malon, that is not the case. Okay, incredible. Amr Shmuel says as follows: person bows down to a tree. Tosfase asura. Anything that grows on the tree after the moment that he bowed down to it is asur. So obviously, it sounds like this is the case of where the tree was planted for regular purposes. Then the akum came along and bowed down to it. So anything that grows post bowing is going to have the status of avodah zarah. Okay, Master Abelazar Gido Upisla Avodas Kochavim Vehechlef Venotam Ashichlef. So I'll say that ultimately again, so Rabbi Elazar raised the kasha to Shmuel. He says doesn't make any sense. The Mishnah says if you pruned or if you trimmed the tree for the sake of avodah zarah, and then there were new growths, the new growths were aser. So Gido Upislo in. So it sounds like you have to do a maisa. You have to prune it or trim it for the sake of avodah zarah. Then the new growths are aser. But again, lo Gido Upislo lo. But if you didn't prune it, you didn't trim it, and you just bowed down to it, it sounds like that would not create a problem. So therefore, again, Rabbi Elazar is raising his kasha on Shmuel. So the Gemara says, Shmuel says, Hamani Rabbanani. Shmuel says, whose opinion is reflected in the Mishnah? That's the opinion of the Rabbanan. This goes back to Shabbos' daf. Ushmuel Damar Rabbi Yosi Bar Yehuda. And Shmuel himself holds like Rabbi Yosi Bar Yehuda. The Amar, who says Ilan Shenat Labasof Avdu Aser. So again, I will say we've seen this is a fundamental machlokas between the Rabban Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. That ultimately Rabbi Yossi is the one who says that even if you planted a tree for regular mundane purposes, if you worshipped it, it subsequently becomes aser. So that's Shmuel's view, but that is not the view mentioned in the Mishnah. Okay, so Maskef Ravashi. So Ravashi raised a kasha. Mimayd Rabbi Yosef Yehuda v'Rabbanan b'Tosefes pligi. So do Rabbi Yosef Yehuda and the Rabbanan, do they really argue in a case of Tosefes? Or mostly just understand what's happening over here. Our Mishnah said, right? Our Mishnah said that if you have a regular tree and then you prune it or you trim it for the sake of avodah zarah, so you're doing a ma'aseh with the tree, Any new growths are usher as avodah zara. Shmuel comes along and says, even if you didn't prune it or trim it, you just bow down to it. Any new growths are usher als avodah zara. So the Gemara now is suggesting that machlokes between Shmuel and Rabbi Lazar is actually machlokes in the Rabbanon and Rabbi Yossi. The Rabbanon's view is mentioned in the Mishnah that if you just bow down to a tree that was planted for mundane purposes, you haven't done anything. In other words, the act, I shouldn't say you haven't done anything. In other words, obviously it's an act of avodah zarah, but you don't fundamentally change the tree. The Rabbi Yehuda holds that even if something was planted for mundane purposes, if you bow to it, if you worship it, from that point of bowing forward, the item is endowed with avodah zarah identity. That's the machlokes over here. Maskei Ravashi. How do you know that Rabbi Yossi and the Rabban are arguing with new growth? Dilma, B'Tosef is a divrei hakol. So maybe everyone agrees that when you bow down to a tree, the new growths are certainly usher. Everyone will agree to that. What's the machlokes? Ubi karo pligi. And perhaps they're arguing about the status of the tree itself post-worship. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Savri Karnami Aser. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda holds that when you bow down to the tree itself becomes Aser. Dichsiv Vashereim Tisrafun Ba'ish. Because the pasuk says you have to destroy their asheros, and therefore, again, once you worship it, by definition, you endow it with avodah zarah identity. But Rabbanan Savri Rabbanan hold no Iker Ilan Shari. Ultimately, again, the Iker Ilan, the primary tree, remains permitted. Why? Dichsiv Vashereim Tigadeun. You shall uproot their asher trees. I will say now, what the Rabbanan are pointing out over here is, once it says Vasherehem Tis Rafun, that you have to burn their asheros, why do you need to say anything else? Why do you have to say Va'ashem Tigadeun? You have to uproot it. Why do you need that second phrase? Ezu Ilon Shekidua also Vikara Shari, because it's telling you there's a type of tree where the new growth is aser, but the primary tree remains mutter. What type of tree is that? Havi Omer Ilan Shenatu Labasov Avdu. What type of tree is that? That's a tree that was initially planted for mundane purposes, then let's say pruned or trimmed. The new growths ultimately again become aser. And again, the Gemara says maybe perhaps you'll say the reason we don't answer that up like this is because because again, I will say the proofs that each of them brought are potentially interchangeable. First wide line in Cain, Gido upisulo man katanila. If that's the case, then who is the author of our Mishnah, who said that if you worshipped a mundane tree, I should say, if you pruned or trimmed the mundane tree, that the new growths are usher? Who's the author? Lo Rabbanon, lo Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda. It would neither be the Rabbanon or Rabbi Yehuda. Irabanon below Gido Pisulo Namito Sefes Asura. If it's going to the Rabbanon, then ultimately again, without pruning or trimming it, the additional growth should also be aser. And Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, Iker Ilan Nami Aser. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, the primary tree itself would also be aser after worship. So Gemara says, how do we answer this up? Ibais Ema. Ibais Ema Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. Ibais Ema Rabbi Yossi. I'm sorry. Ibais Ema Rabbanon. You're right. The views here could be reflective of either the Rabbanon or Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. How so? Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, Kikar Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda below Gido Upisilu Iker Ilan Aser. When ultimately again does Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda say that if you worship a tree, even if you don't prune it or trim it, right, but you worship it, that the primary tree itself becomes aser? When is that? Bistama. We'll say it's interesting. Stama means you just worship the tree as a whole without specifying any particular part of the tree that you are worshiping. Whereas I guess when it comes to tree worship, a person could say like, I'm a trunk guy, or, I'm a branch guy, But again, let's say you just stam worship. According to Rabbi Yehuda, ultimately, again, that makes the entire tree ultimately aser. Aval gido upisulo Goli adaite debitosefta nechale. Be'ikreila no lechale. But if you prune or you trim a tree for avodah zarah purposes, what are you saying? That really what I'm worshiping is what? The new growths. Interesting. The Gemara says, Another possibility is it reflects the view of the Rabbanon. How so? The Gemara says, Gido upisulo itzrichale. Ultimately, again, we need the case, ultimately, of pruning and trimming. Why? Because you've come to Rabbanon, I might have thought like this. Since by pruning and trimming, you are doing something with the actual tree itself. Therefore, I might have thought that the actual tree itself becomes aser. Kamash Malon, that is not the case. Kamash Malon, that halacha lamaisa, the ikar tree remains mutter, and ultimately, again, the new growths become aser. Okay, so we'll say, so halacha lamaisa, what do we do with this? What do we do with this? So therefore, again, remember, 2 out of the 3 categories are pretty straightforward. Category 1 is that I plant the tree for the sake of Avoda Zara. What is that called? What is that called? What is that called? Asherah. Right? So now again, remember, suddenly there's not a type of tree Asherah, but rather again, any tree that is worshipped, right, that is planted for the sake of Avodah Zara is called Asherah. That's category 1. Category 3, I put Avodah Zara, again, I keep saying Ayabose, but again, remember, we're talking about an Akum who's doing these things, because remember, I say this every day, if a Jew does it, it changes the math on all of this stuff in a bad way. So I might say again, Akum puts Avodah Zara under the tree. What's the halacha? What's the halacha? While the Avodah Zara is under the tree itself, the tree is aser, because the tree is considered to be an attendant, right? It's attending to Avodah Zara. But once the Avodah Zara is removed from under the tree is totally mutter. What about case 2? Case 2 is the one that we spent this entire sugya on. Akum pruned or trimmed the tree for the sake of Avodah Zara. So what is that? What does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says ultimately, again, that is the new growths ultimately, again, are aser al Avodah Zara, but the tree itself remains permitted. The tree itself remains permitted. And Rabbi say that is how the Rambam paskins as well. Now, whether that reflects the view of the Rabbanon, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, okay, so that's a whole machlokes. But bottom line, just also to clarify, the way we paskin is, if an akum goes in, if there's a tree, and the tree was planted for regular mundane purposes, and the akum bows down to it, we paskin like the Rabbanon, that tree does not become aser. That tree is like the mountain. That does not become aser. Remember, again, this circles back. Anything that is naturally occurring cannot be made into Avodah Zara unless, of course, there is some type of human intervention that affected change in the item. That's why if you prune or you trim the tree, you're doing something to the tree. Okay. But even then, when you do something to the tree, what happens? That which grows subsequently will be Avodah Zara, but ultimately the tree itself, the ikar of the tree, still remains permitted. Incredible. Mishnah, Ezu Asherah. What is an Asherah tree? I both say now, again, remember, the Gemara is asking a different kind of question because you already established what's an Asherah tree. At least in our pure definition, any tree planted for the sake of Avodah Zara is called an Asherah tree. Now the Gemara says, Ezu Asherah. What is an Asherah? Okay, we'll see exactly what the Mishnah's question is. Any tree underneath which you find an idol or idolatry, that is called an Asherah tree. We'll explain exactly how the line of this Mishnah stems with the previous Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon says, Kol she'ovdin osa, any tree that you worship, ultimately again is called an Asherah tree. So listen to this. There was one time, so we'll say, so again, there is some type of machlokes happening over here. The Tanakama holds an Asherah tree is any tree that has Avodah Zara underneath it. Rabbi Shimon holds that any Asherah tree is any tree that you worship. So one time it happened in Sidon that there was a tree that they worshipped. Umatzu tachtov gal. And they found like a pile of dirt underneath the tree. Amar Rabbi Shimon says, Badku es hagal. Go and dig up the pile. It's like Alazat. Badku matzu botsura. They found an idol buried underneath the tree. Amar lahan hoil ulutsura hein ovdin natural sailan. Good news. Since there's an idol there, the assumption is that they really were worshiping the idol, not the tree. So therefore, because they're worshiping the idol, therefore the tree itself becomes permitted. Okay. So it says now let's a little bit of a strange Mishnah. So it says the Gemara, Ezu Asherah. What do you mean when the Mishnah says what's an Asherah? We just learned this in the previous Mishnah. Vanan shalosh Asheros Tanan. We literally just learned this in the previous Mishnah. What did the Mishnah say? There are 3 different types of Asherah trees. We literally just did this. That's what it means to say. Shtayim l'divrei hakol va'achas machlokas v'Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanon. There are 2 cases of Asherah. that everyone agrees with. And then there's one case of Asherah that is Machlokas Rabbi Shimon the Rabbanon. What's the case? What's the Asherah case that's the Machlokas? Kol sheyesh tachteha avodas kochavim. This is very interesting. Any case where you find an idol underneath the tree. That's the Machlokas case. Why? Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kol she'ovdin osa. I'm sorry. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon Omer Kol she'ovdin osa. So also say, interestingly enough, the Machlokas over here is when you go ahead and you find an idol underneath the tree. Does that make it into an Asherah tree? Tanakama says, the Rabbanan say yes, and Rabbi Shimon says no. Rabbi Shimon says if there's an idol underneath the tree, then what? They're worshiping the idol, not the tree. That's the Machlokes case. Okay, and I will say, now, by the way, now the rest of the Mishnah actually makes sense because then the Mishnah tells the story. What was the story? There was a tree in Sidon that everybody was worshiping. There was a pile of dirt underneath the tree. Rabbi Shimon says, hey, dig up the pile. They dug it up. They found an idol. Rabbi Shimon says, oh, good news. They were never really worshiping the tree. They were worshiping the idol. Therefore, the tree is permitted. Okay, so Gemara says, Ezu hi Asherah stam. So the Gemara says, what's like stam and Asherah? Just like, now we're trying to figure out like, what would be some Asherah cases that everyone, or really, what the Gemara is asking is like this. What is the identifying mark of an Asherah? Now, I understand definitionally what an Asherah is, right? An Asherah is any tree that is planted for Avoda Zara. What the Gemara seems to be asking over here is, you're walking down the street, you see a tree. What would be some identifying marks, right? Or some identifying simanim that what you're looking at is an Asherah tree? How would you be able to pick that out? The Gemara says, listen to this. Amar Rav, okay, here's a good one. Anytime you see a bunch of idolatrous priests sitting underneath a tree that bears fruit and no one touches the fruit. Good. So if you happen to see that, it's a pretty sure bet that is an Avoda Zara, that's an Asherah. Shmuel says, Afilu Amri Hani Tamri Lebei Netzarfi Aser Darebo Shikra V'Shasle B'Yomi Dam. Even if you hear people saying, "Oh, the dates of this tree, we're going to save them for Beit Netzarfi." That's the name of their temple, right? Because again, it was common for idolaters to make beer. Remember again, about sometimes in the Gemara they drank date beer to make date beer for their Avodah Zara on their Yom Tiv. Okay, so again, I will say, see here what's happening over here. First indicator would be seeing the priests sit there and they don't eat the fruit. Second indicator is that halacha l'maisa. Even if they eat the fruit, but they have to utilize the fruit when? On their Yom Tiv. Ultimately, again, and Amemar said, the elders of Pumpadisa told me that the halacha follows Shmuel. And others will say, so again, remember, the machlokas are between Rav and Shmuel. As Rav says that if it's an Asherah tree, no one touches the fruit. Shmuel says that's not true. They'll eat the fruit, not for quote-unquote mundane purposes, only for ritualistic purposes, but Lamaisa, they would still eat the fruit. And again, the halacha is Shmuel. So again, if you see a tree and the fruit is only utilized for Avodah Zara purposes, that is an Asherah. Incredible. Amid Beis, let's go. Kol lo yeshe b'tzila. So as I say now, again, if we are dealing over here with an Avodah Zara tree, an Asherah tree, so the Mishnah says you cannot sit in its shade. Nebo says we're going to see, this is not talking about the actual shade of the branches. That's obvious. That's obvious, right? Because sitting in the shade of an Asherah is mamish getting benefit from the Asherah. So of course, that is going to be Asr. That's not what we're talking about over here. Lo yeshev etzila, vim yashav tahar. But if you sat in the shade, ultimately, again, you're tar. We'll see the meaning of all of this in just a little bit. But al yavar tachtel, similarly, again, you really should not even walk underneath the Asherah tree. Vim avar tameh. And if you did so, you are tameh. Okay, we'll clarify everything in the Gemara. Haisa gozelas es harabim. What happens if the Asherah tree extended into Rosh Hashanah? So literally, again, I will say, can you imagine this could be a real problem? You have an overgrown Asherah tree, right? Very inconsiderate, idolatrous neighbors, right? So the Asherah tree is growing into Rosh Hashanah. Now the problem over here is that Allah Lamaisa. Here's what we glean from this Mishnah. That if you go ahead and you walk literally underneath the branches of an Asherah tree, you are tameh. Now, what type of tameh we'll have to see, but you are tameh. The problem is if that tree extends into Rosh Hashanah, what am I supposed to do? So the Gemara says, halacha l'maisa, if it extends into Rosh Hashanah and you walk underneath it, ultimately tar. You are tar. You are tar. Incredible. On both sides. So now, obviously, now if you look at Rashi, Rashi says over here, let's just look at this Rashi, even though what will make a little bit more sense in the Gemara. The hach tuma d'Rabbanani, ukrad d'maisina b'Gemara asmach d'ba'aman. On both sides, we're going to see, apparently, now, when you're going into the branch of Avoda Zara, what does this sound like? From a Torah perspective, what does this sound like? What does it sound like? What type of tumah? Tumas ohel. Now, again, Rashi points out over here. So, what the Mishnah is telling me is, if you walk underneath the branch of an Asherah tree, you are tamei alts tumas ohel. Now, what type of tumah does Avodah Zara convey? Rashi is already telling us this is tumah d'Rabbanan. It's d'Rabbanan. Now, what the source even of that rabbinic tumah is, we'll see in just a moment. It's rabbinic tumah. Now, obviously, the good news is that since it's rabbinic tumah, what Chazal have the ability to do what? To legislate when the tumah applies and when the tumah doesn't apply. They have that ability. Because they have that ability, therefore, halacha l'maisa, they have the ability to say, if you're walking under it of your own volition, okay, then you're going to be tamei. But if it's extending into Rosh Hashanah, and therefore, again, that's inappropriate. I'm minding my own business. I'm just walking the Shram, which I'm allowed to do. Chazal said the Tumah doesn't apply in that case. All right, so let's analyze. A lot to unpack over here. Says the Gemara. Lo yeshe b'tzila pshita. Let's go through the first case. What was the first case in the Mishnah? First case in the Mishnah was you cannot sit in the shade of Avodah Zara. So you have an Asherah tree. Let's just go most basic level. Right? The tree was planted for the sake of Avodah Zara. Therefore, it is an Asherah. So now it has nice big branches. Can't compliment it. It has ugly big branches, right? But that provide a lot of shade. So I can't sit underneath. The Gemara says that's obvious. That's because we'll say sitting underneath the shade of the branches is what? What do we call that? Hana. That's benefit. So of course you can't. Forget about tumah, right? Forget about tumah right now, right? That's obvious. I can't do that. That we'll say that'll be Isidoraisa. I can't get hana from Avodah Zara. So what's the shayla over there? Where it says pshita. Amra Barachana, Amra Biochana lo nitzcha el tzel tzila. So it's very interesting. It's talking about the shadow of the shadow. And I will say very often, right, if you have a tree, right, so the tree casts a primary shadow, and then there is a secondary shadow. I might have thought, and this is talking about from the height of the tree, as we'll see in just a moment. I might have thought that the prohibition to benefit ultimately, again, is only from the primary shadow. But from the secondary shadow, secondary shadow is like a fainter shadow. There would not be a problem. Ultimately, again, kamash malon, even in the secondary shadow, you're not allowed to get benefit. Gemara says, Michlal, the Bitzel Kamasa, Im Yashav, Tame, I'm sorry. Let's do that again. Lo yeshiv tzila pshita. That's obvious. Now let's do that. That is the secondary shadow. Michlal, the Bitzel Kamasa, Im Yashav, Tame. Is that telling me ultimately again that if I sat in the shadow, right? This is the shadow ultimately again of the height of the tree. That if I sat there, it'd be tamei. To which the Gemara said, "Lo, that filo letzel kamasa nami im yashav tar." No, not necessarily. If you sit in the shadow ultimately again of the height, you will be tar. V'hakamashan da filo letzel tzila lo yeshiv. The idea over here is anytime you're sitting in secondary shadow, you're not going to become tamei, right? But lamaisi, you still shouldn't do it. In other words, if I sit underneath the direct canopy of the tree, that is usher and there's tumah. Any secondary shadows are usher. You should not do it. But if you did it, ultimately, again, no tumah. Okay? Seifa. Others go ahead and frame this conversation on the seifa. V'im yashav tahar. Ultimately, again, and if you sat underneath it, you are tar. So Gemara says pshita. That's obvious. Others will both say, of course, if I go ahead and I sit underneath secondary shadow, I'm going to be tar. We're talking about over here the shadow that is cast by the height of the tree. So does that mean that for the secondary shadow, ultimately again, you could sit there even lechatchila? Lo, no, it's teaching us that if you sat in the shadow of the height of the tree, you're going to be tar. So say, bottom line, what's the takeaway? Takeaway as well says like this. Again, we're going to circle back to the previous case. So halacha might say, if you sit underneath direct canopy, direct shade of the tree, aser and tamei. Anytime you're sitting in a secondary shadow, never tuma, but it's going to be aser nevertheless in all cases. Incredible. V'lo yavar tachtavim avar tamei. Okay, so we'll say, so the next case is like this. So now, okay, so here's what we know. when you go underneath the shade of, you go under the canopy, because remember again, it has to be like a tumas ohel case. So when you go under the canopy, ultimately again of Avoda Zara, ultimately again there is going to be tuma, rabbinic tuma. Rabbinic tuma. So says the Gemara, "V'lo ya'avar tachtavim avar tamei." Therefore, you should not pass underneath the canopy of Avodah Zara, the shade of Avodah Zara, and if you did so, ultimately again you're tamei. Okay, says the Gemara, "My time. What's the reason? I afshar deleka takruvas avodas kochavim." Money. So let's say maybe you say like this, because at the end of the day, Rashi says over here, so we'll say maybe the din is like this. Anytime you find an Asherah, chances are that what? There is an idol beneath it or buried beneath it. In which case then the tree, the Asherah tree itself, serves as an ohel until I'm under the same roof as me and the Avodah Zara. Says, is that what's happening over here? So the Gemara says, if that's the case, money, Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira, Rabbi Desanya, Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira Omer, Minayin litakroves avodas kocham shemetami ba'ohel. We'll say, how do I know that Avodah Zara itself conveys tumah ba'ohel underneath the same roof? If I'm underneath the same roof as Avodah Zara, that literally again I become tamish shenemar vayitzmedu lebal par. They literally worshipped the Baal Pa'ar and they ate the corpses of the dead. So the Gemara says, or offerings to the dead. So what do you see from this pasuk? Pasuk is comparing Avodah Zara ultimately again to a mace. Ma mace mitame ba'ohel af takroves avodas kochavim mitame ba'ohel. Just as ultimately again a corpse conveys to us ohel, so to Avodah Zara conveys to us also. So we'll say this is very important. This is incredibly important. So the concept ultimately, again, the source for a corpse conveying tumah, the source for Avodah Zara conveying tumah, ultimately, again, is its comparison to a corpse. Now remember again, as much as the Gemara over here is quoting a pasuk, this is a din drabanan. This is rabbinic law. This is not biblical. So therefore, again, the juxtaposition, or I should say the comparison to Avodah Zara and mace tells us that just like a mace conveys to us, so to Avodah Zara. Therefore, back to the Mishnah, do not go ahead and walk underneath the canopy of Avodah Zara, of an Asherah. Because again, we assume that if there's a tree, at some point either is Avodah Zara there, was Avodah Zara buried there, and therefore you are tamim midrabanan tumas oil. Incredible. Says the Gemara, Haisa gozelas asarabim. So we'll say now that, what about the last case? Right, so now what's the last case? If the Asherah tree overextends its borders and goes into Rosh Hashanah, and the branches against Rosh Hashanah again, and I walk under it, then what's the halacha? I am tar. I'm not tamei. So says the Gemara, a very interesting case. Ibayluhu, avar or over? It's very interesting, right? Lashon the Mishnah is Haisa gozel sasarabim. If the Asherah tree extended into Rosh Hashanah, va'avar tachta tar, and you go underneath it, you pass underneath it, you're tar. The rabbis did not legislate in that case. The Gemara now asks, how do you read that word? Is the word avar or over? So it's interesting the word avar and over. Avar means if you went through, ex post facto. Over means you can go through. What's the chilik? What is the Mishnah saying? Is the Mishnah saying, L'chatchila, I'm allowed to walk underneath that tree because the rabbis are not going over there, or no? You really should still try to avoid walking underneath it, even Rosh Hashanah. But if you walked underneath it ex post facto, you're still tar. It's a big nafkamina. So Rabbi Yitzchak ben Elazar, Mishmei Dechizkiya Omar, over. So interesting, Rabbi Yitzchak says, over, L'chatchila. Right, you are allowed to walk underneath that tree. The rabbis were not gozer in that case. There is no tumah, and therefore Allah Lamaisi, you are allowed to walk dafka lechatchila underneath that tree. Rabbi Yochanan Amar im avar. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Halacha Lamaisa, ideally avoid it. If you can't avoid it, ultimately you can walk underneath it. Below pligi, the Gemara says they're not arguing. Very interesting. I will say so. They're not arguing. What does everything depend on? Is there another path? Is there another path? If there's another path, everyone agrees, take it. If there's not another path, ultimately, again, everyone agrees, you can walk through. I'm going to have Shesha, the Gemara ends off with an interesting story. I'm going to have Shesha to Shameh. If Shesha said to his attendant, Kimatis lahasam. So apparently they had this case where they were walking through the Rabbim. There was an overhanging asherah tree. So he said to his attendant, Kimatis lahasam arihitani. When we get to that spot with the overhanging asherah tree, do me a favor, help me run past. Like help me run. In other words, they were going to pass under it, but help me run under it quickly. So the Gemara says, Hechidami, what's the case? If there's no other path, right? If this was the only way through, then what? It's mutter. If it's mutter, why do you have to run? But again, if there is another path, so who cares? Just because you're running, right? Just because you're running through it doesn't make it mutter. So it's going on the olam deleka dir kachrina. In reality, there was not another path, and therefore, Rav Sheshas was totally permitted to walk through this path. So why did he say? Why did he say to his attendant, "Let's run through"? The Gemara says, "Va'adam chashuv shiny." Ultimately, again, because Rav Sheshas obviously is Adam Chashuv, and what was he concerned about? He didn't want people to see him underneath that tree. Because, of course, remember, people, lav dafka, that people are knowledgeable about all of these circumstances. So he was concerned that if people see him through that tree and they don't understand context, they may glean from that halacha l'maisa, you're allowed to go ahead and walk underneath a tree like this in general. And therefore, he said, in order to avoid any type of suspicion like this, halacha l'maisa, to go ahead and run through the tree very quickly. So therefore, again, therefore, what we see from here, just the takeaways, is number one, the idea that if the tree is planted for the sake of Avoda Zara, of course, it's going to be aser. Walking underneath the canopy ultimately conveys tuma. It is a tuma d'Rabbanan. If it extends into Rosh Hashanah, you're allowed to walk through it, assuming that what? There's not another path. But if there is another pathway through, ultimately, again, take that other pathway. Halacha l'maisa adam chashuv. Even if there is another pathway, still has to be conscious about what his actions look like. And I will say that last story is also very, sometimes in life, like we have to take compromised pathways, right? There are times in life where I have to do things that are far from ideal, right? What's the avoda in life? Get it done as quickly as possible. In other words, don't linger in the less than ideal circumstances in life. Sometimes we don't have a choice, but do what has to get done and move yourself forward to the next stage. Rabosai, wow, what a run. Shkoya, this is great job. So stop over for today. Shkoya, everyone.